He was only 2 weeks old when the machines went flat. Irreversible brain damage, the doctors whispered, urging his parents to say their final goodbyes. But then, a tiny rejected golden retriever puppy did something that challenged every law of neuroscience. What Sonny discovered in those silent NICU hours would leave the world's top surgeons speechless. Stay until the end to witness the exact moment Eli reached out, a miracle that proved even the smallest hearts can restart a life. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The rhythmic hum of the ventilator was the only sound in the sterile room, a constant reminder of the silence where Eli's laughter should have been. Outside, a winter storm lashed against the hospital glass, but inside the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fading hope. Rebecca sat hunched over the isolette, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold plastic. For 3 days she hadn't moved. "The scans are clear, Rebecca," James murmured from the shadows, his voice cracked from exhaustion. "There's no activity in the cortex. We have to think about his quality of life." "He's in there, James," she snapped, her eyes never leaving Eli's vacant stare. "I can feel him." The tension was shattered by a soft, urgent whimper. In the doorway stood her mother, holding a trembling bundle of golden fur. Sonny, the runt of the litter, looked as fragile as the baby in the bed. But as soon as the puppy was set down, he didn't head for the food or the warmth of the blankets. He scrambled toward the isolette, his tiny paws scratching at the glass. When they finally let the puppy near, the room froze. Sonny didn't just sniff. He pressed his warm chest directly against Eli's heart and began a low, rhythmic purr. Suddenly the EKG monitor chirped. A spike. Then the impossible. Eli's tiny index finger curled, brushing against Sonny's fur. What was this tiny puppy sensing that million-dollar scanners had missed? The sunlight that morning was a pale, buttery yellow, spilling across the nursery floor in long, warm slats that seemed to promise nothing but peace. Rebecca Carter moved through the room with the quiet, rhythmic grace of a woman who had finally found her rhythm in the beautiful chaos of new motherhood. She was humming a low, wordless melody, something her own mother had sung to her, as she folded a stack of tiny, impossibly soft organic cotton onesies. Each one smelled of lavender-scented detergent and that unmistakable, intoxicating scent of a newborn. It was the scent of a miracle. In the white wicker bassinet positioned perfectly by the window, 2-week-old Eli was a masterpiece of stillness. His chest rose and fell in a shallow, rhythmic dance, his tiny features relaxed in the deep, heavy sleep that only the truly innocent can achieve. He was a perfect blend of his parents, James's stubborn chin and Rebecca's long, delicate eyelashes. To Rebecca, he was more than just a baby. He was the physical manifestation of every prayer they had ever whispered during the long years they spent wondering if they would ever be able to conceive. "He's still out." James's voice was a low rumble as he leaned against the doorframe, a steaming mug of coffee in each hand. He was still in his pajama pants, his hair sleep-mussed, wearing the kind of tired but happy expression that had become his permanent uniform since they brought Eli home from the hospital. Rebecca looked up and smiled, a strand of chestnut hair falling across her face. "Like a light. I think the bath wore him out. He's so perfect, James. Sometimes I just stare at him and wait for someone to tell me I'm dreaming." James walked over, handing her a mug and pressing a kiss to the top of her head. They stood there together for a long moment, staring down at their son. The world outside their suburban home didn't exist. The mortgage, the looming return to work, the petty stresses of the neighborhood, it all vanished in the presence of that bassinet. "We did good, Becca," James whispered. "He's the best thing we've ever done." "The very best," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. The morning proceeded with a delicious, slow-motion domesticity. James retreated to the kitchen to start a second pot of coffee and perhaps flip some pancakes, while Rebecca continued her quiet work in the nursery. The house felt solid, safe, and impenetrable. They discussed their plans for the weekend: a short walk in the park if the weather held, the possibility of James's parents coming over for dinner. It was a life of small, beautiful certainties. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a loud sound, just 2 melodic notes that echoed through the hallway. Rebecca checked the baby monitor, then glanced at the bassinet. Eli hadn't even flinched. "I'll get it," she called out to James. "It's probably that package of swaddles I ordered." She stepped out of the nursery, the door clicking softly but not quite latching behind her. She moved down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. It was a journey of no more than 30 feet. She opened the front door to find a delivery driver leaving a small cardboard box on the porch. She offered a quick, polite wave as he headed back to his truck, then bent down to retrieve the package. She took a moment to check the mail, breathing in the crisp morning air, thinking for a fleeting second how lucky she was to have a home, a husband, and a healthy son. She was gone for exactly 30 seconds. When Rebecca stepped back inside and closed the door, the silence of the house hit her differently. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a sleeping baby anymore. It was a heavy, vacuum-like silence that made the hair on her arms stand up. She walked back toward the nursery, her heart beginning a slow, dull thud against her ribs. "James?" she called out, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Did you check on him?" "Just finishing the batter." James called back from the kitchen, the clatter of a whisk against a bowl providing a hauntingly normal backdrop to the rising dread in her chest. Rebecca pushed the nursery door open. The sun was still shining. The lavender scent still lingered. But when she looked into the bassinet, the world didn't just stop, it shattered. Eli wasn't sleeping. His face, usually a soft, healthy pink, was a terrifying shade of dusky, mottled blue. His mouth was open, a small amount of milky spit up pooling at the corner of his lips. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. He was a small, limp doll made of cold marble. A sound escaped Rebecca's throat, a high, keening wail that didn't sound human. "James? James, help. He's not breathing." The whisk hit the kitchen floor with a metallic clang. A second later, James burst into the room, his face draining of color the instant he saw Rebecca's hands shaking over the bassinet. He didn't hesitate. He scooped Eli's small, lifeless body into his arms, his movements frantic but driven by a primal, desperate instinct. "Call 911. Now." James roared, his voice cracking with a terror Rebecca had never heard. Rebecca fumbled for her phone, her fingers feeling like lead. She dialed the 3 digits, her vision blurring as she watched James lay Eli on the changing table. He began the agonizingly delicate process of infant CPR, 2 tiny fingers pressing into that fragile chest, followed by a breath so gentle it seemed impossible it could save a life. 911, what is your emergency?" The operator's voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the carnage of Rebecca's soul. "My baby, my son, he's blue. He's not breathing. Please, oh God, please help us." Rebecca was screaming now, pacing the small confines of the nursery, her eyes fixed on James's face. James was crying, great, silent, racking sobs shaking his shoulders as he counted the compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. "Help is on the way, ma'am. Stay on the line with me. Is your husband performing CPR?" "Yes. Yes, he's doing it. Why isn't he waking up? Eli, please. Eli, look at mommy." Minutes felt like decades. The arrival of the sirens was a distant, wailing hope that seemed to take forever to get closer. When the paramedics finally burst through the door, they moved with a clinical, terrifying speed, gentling James aside. They hooked Eli to a portable monitor. A flat, mocking line appeared on the screen. They intubated him right there on the nursery floor, the tiny plastic tube disappearing into his throat. Rebecca watched, paralyzed, as they pushed a needle into her son's leg to administer epinephrine. "We have a pulse," one of the paramedics shouted, but there was no joy in his voice. It was grim, professional. "But he's not sustaining. We need to move. Now." The ride to the hospital was a blurred montage of red lights and the smell of ozone and sweat. Rebecca sat in the front of the ambulance, her hands pressed against the dashboard, praying to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. James followed in their car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind a recurring loop of the moment he felt Eli's chest go cold under his fingers. The emergency room was a gauntlet of fluorescent lights and shouting voices. Eli was whisked away behind double doors where Rebecca and James were forbidden to follow. They were left in a small, windowless, quiet room. The kind of room designed for people whose lives are about to end. The air in the room was stale, the chairs covered in a depressing blue vinyl. They sat in silence for hours, the only sound the ticking of a clock that seemed to be mocking their desperation. Every time the door opened, they both stood up, their hearts in their throats, only to find a nurse offering water they didn't want or asking for insurance information they couldn't remember. Finally, the door opened and stayed open. A man in a white coat walked in. He looked older than the other doctors, his face etched with the weary lines of a man who had delivered too much bad news. His badge read Dr. Morrison, Neonatal Neurology. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of the false optimism they had been clinging to. "How is he?" Rebecca lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's sleeve. "Is he awake? Can I see him?" Dr. Morrison sighed, a sound that felt like a death knell. He gestured for them to sit down. Eli is alive. We have stabilized his heart and his breathing is being managed by a ventilator. But, he paused, looking down at his clipboard. The period of oxygen deprivation was significant. Based on the reports from the paramedics and our initial assessments, Eli was without a sustained heart rate or breath for approximately 4 to 6 minutes. What does that mean? James asked, his voice a ghost of itself. It means Eli has suffered what we call a severe hypoxic ischemic brain injury, Morrison explained, his eyes meeting theirs with a painful honesty. When the brain is starved of oxygen for that long, especially at such a fragile age, the damage is catastrophic. We've performed a CT scan and an initial MRI. He turned on a small monitor on the wall, displaying a series of black and white images of Eli's brain. To Rebecca they looked like Rorschach tests, but as Dr. Morrison pointed to the dark, shadowed areas, the reality began to sink in. These dark regions here and here, this is dead tissue, the doctor said. The damage is widespread, affecting the motor cortex, the basal ganglia, and the brainstem. In neonatal cases, the brain has some plasticity, but the sheer volume of the injury we're seeing here it's irreversible. Irreversible? Rebecca whispered. You mean he won't walk? He'll need therapy? Dr. Morrison looked at her with a profound, clinical pity. Mrs. Carter, it's much more than that. Based on the lack of electrical activity we're seeing, Eli is in what we classify as a persistent vegetative state. Even if he survives the next few days, he will likely never wake up. He will have no awareness of his surroundings, no ability to move on his own, no cognitive function. He won't know who you are. The room tilted. Rebecca felt the floor drop away. She didn't cry, she couldn't. The grief was too large for tears. It was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made it impossible to draw breath. James let out a broken, choked sound, his head falling into his hands. We want to keep him comfortable, Morrison continued. But you need to understand the prognosis. The medical reality is that the son you knew, the boy who was born 2 weeks ago, he is essentially gone. The next 3 days were a descent into a specific kind of hell. They lived in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, a forest of beeping machines and tangled plastic tubing. Eli lay in the center of it all, a tiny island of stillness in a sea of technology. He was breathing now. The ventilator had been turned down to its lowest setting to see if he could manage on his own, and physically he looked almost normal. His skin had returned to its soft cream color. His hair was still a fine golden fuzz. But when Rebecca looked into his eyes, there was nothing there. They were open but they didn't see. They didn't track the light. They didn't focus on her face. They were vacant, glassy, staring at a horizon that only the dying can see. His body was limp, his tiny hands, once so quick to grab a finger, now lay open and unresponsive. There was no crying, no fussing, no movement. Just the rhythmic hiss-click of the monitors and the crushing realization that their perfect life had ended in a 30-second span of spit up and a closed door. Rebecca sat by the bed in the dim glow of the nightlight, holding his small, unresponsive hand. The guilt was a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. If she hadn't gone to the door. If she had stayed 1 second longer. If she had heard him. Please, she whispered, her voice a ragged thread in the silence of the NICU. Please come back to me, baby. Just one sign. Just one. She leaned down, pressing her forehead against his, waiting for a twitch, a sigh, anything. But Eli remained a silent statue, a prisoner of his own broken mind. The doctors had already begun the subtle, painful process of discussing end-of-life options, their voices clinical and detached. They spoke of mercy and dignity, words that felt like a betrayal. James had started to withdraw, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, his logic beginning to align with the grim data on the screens. But as the clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m. on the 4th day, a strange sound echoed from the hallway, a sound that shouldn't have been in a hospital. It was a high-pitched, desperate whimpering, coming from a visitor who didn't care about medical scans or neurological irreversibility. Rebecca didn't know it yet, but as she sat there in the darkness, mourning a son who was still breathing, a tiny golden-furred creature was being carried toward their room. A creature who could hear a heartbeat that the doctors had already written off. What this tiny visitor was about to do wouldn't just challenge the hospital's diagnosis. It would force the medical world to ask a terrifying question. What if the machines were wrong about where a soul begins? Rebecca looked up as the door creaked open, her mother standing there with a look of desperate, wild hope in her eyes, holding a small bundle that was shivering with an inexplicable, frantic energy. Rebecca, her mother whispered, her voice trembling. I know the doctor said it's over. But you need to see what this puppy is doing. He hasn't stopped screaming since the accident, and I think I know why. As the puppy's eyes locked onto the unresponsive baby in the bassinet, the machines in the room began to chime in a way they hadn't in days, a rapid, rhythmic pulse that made the attending nurse freeze in her tracks. What was the runt of the litter sensing that the world's most advanced technology had missed, and why was Eli's heart suddenly racing in sync with the puppy's frantic whimpers? By the 5th day, the neonatal intensive care unit had ceased to feel like a hospital ward and had become a surreal, self-contained universe where time held no meaning. For Rebecca, the sun rising and setting behind the heavy hospital curtains was an abstract concept. Her world had shrunk to the size of a clear plastic isolette and the jagged neon green lines of a cardiac monitor. She hadn't eaten anything more substantial than a lukewarm granola bar in 48 hours. She hadn't slept for more than 20 minutes at a stretch, terrified that if she closed her eyes, Eli would take his last breath in the dark. She sat in the same ergonomic chair, her body molding to its plastic contours until she felt like an extension of the machinery. The smell of the NICU, a sharp, clinical cocktail of rubbing alcohol, industrial detergent, and the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the ventilators, had seeped into her skin and hair. Every few minutes, a nurse would glide by like a ghost, checking fluid levels or adjusting a sensor, their eyes full of a soft, practiced pity that Rebecca had come to loathe. It was the look you gave someone standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Across the small cubicle, James was a shadow of the man he had been a week ago. He had tried to be the pillar, the one who handled the insurance calls and the concerned texts from family, but today he was crumbling. He sat with his head in his hands, his unshaven jaw tight. He was a man of logic and blueprints, a man who believed that if you followed the rules and worked hard, things functioned. But there were no blueprints for a 2-week-old son with a silent brain. Every time he looked at Eli, he didn't see a baby. He saw a mounting list of catastrophic statistics. He was already mourning, his mind beginning to build a wall of protection around his heart, preparing for the inevitable moment they would have to sign the papers to let go. "Becca, please," James whispered, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "You need to walk. Just to the cafeteria. I'll stay right here. I won't take my eyes off him." Rebecca didn't turn her head. Her gaze was locked on Eli's chest. It moved only because the machine commanded it to. "I can't leave him, James. What if he wakes up and I'm not here? What if he's scared?" "The doctor said." "I don't care what the doctor said," she snapped, her voice cracking with the strain of 5 days of suppressed screams. "They look at a screen. I look at my son. They see tissue damage. I see Eli." The heavy double doors of the NICU swished open, and Rebecca's mother, Linda, stepped inside. She looked out of place in the sterile environment, her knit sweater and the scent of the outdoors clinging to her like a memory of a world that was still turning. But she wasn't alone. Under her arm, she held a small, ventilated pet carrier. "Mom? What are you doing?" Rebecca asked, her brow furrowing. "You can't bring a bag in here." Linda walked over, her face a mask of weary determination. "I talked to the head nurse, Sarah. She's a friend of a friend. And I talked to the patient advocate. They have a policy for therapy animals, Rebecca. Usually it's for the long-term kids, but I told them what was happening." She set the carrier down on the floor and knelt beside it. "Honey, Bella had her litter last week. Remember? We were so excited to tell you before all this." Rebecca shook her head, a wave of cold exhaustion washing over her. "Mom, I can't think about a puppy right now. I have a son who is dying in a plastic box. A dog is the last thing I need." "Just look at him," Linda insisted, unlatching the gate. "He's been screaming for 3 days. The vet says he's healthy, but he won't eat with the others. He just sits by the door and cries. I had a feeling, Becca. Call it a grandmother's intuition, but I think he's looking for something." From the carrier emerged a tiny, trembling ball of golden fur. He was the runt, significantly smaller than his siblings, with paws that seemed 3 sizes too big for his spindly legs. His eyes were wide and a deep, soul-searching brown. This was Sonny. He didn't do what a normal puppy would do in a new environment. There was no sniffing of the corners, no playful yapping at the dangling wires. The moment Sonny's paws hit the linoleum, he froze. His nose twitched. He ignored Linda, ignored James, and ignored the nurse who had stopped in the doorway to watch. He turned his head toward Eli's isolette and let out a sound that broke Rebecca's heart, a high, thin, mournful whistle that sounded like a question. "He's too small," James muttered, though he didn't move to stop the puppy. "He's just a baby himself." Sonny began to move. It wasn't the clumsy, hopping gait of a typical golden retriever pup. It was purposeful, almost urgent. He trotted straight to the base of the isolette and stood on his hind legs, his tiny front paws scratching at the transparent plastic. He was whimpering now, a frantic, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "He wants in," Rebecca whispered, her hand rising to her mouth. "Rebecca, it's not sanitary," James started, but the nurse, Sarah, stepped forward. She had been the one to witness the flatline on day one, and she had seen the despair in this room every hour since. "The isolette has side ports," Sarah said softly, her voice low so the shift lead wouldn't hear. "If I open the porthole and you hold him, as long as he doesn't touch the sterile lines, the risk is minimal. Sometimes sensory input, scent, sound, can help with neonatal distress. Though in this case..." She trailed off, the irreversible diagnosis hanging in the air. Rebecca didn't wait for a second opinion. She scooped the tiny puppy into her arms. Sonny was vibrating, his heart beating so fast against her palms it felt like a bird's wing. He didn't struggle. He leaned his weight toward the baby. Rebecca reached into the circular port of the isolette, her hands trembling, and lowered Sonny toward her son. The puppy didn't go for Eli's feet or his hands. With a precision that felt eerie, Sonny pressed his wet nose directly against the thin, paper-white skin of Eli's chest, right over his heart. He stayed there, his small body draped over the baby, and began to whimper in a low, oscillating frequency. "Look at the monitor," Linda whispered. James leaned forward, his eyes widening. The EKG line, which had been a steady, mechanical 110 beats per minute for days, suddenly began to fluctuate. It climbed to 115, then 122. It wasn't a spike of distress. It was a rhythmic shift, as if Eli's heart was trying to find the tempo of the puppy's breathing. "It's a coincidence," James said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The puppy's warmth is just triggering a basic thermal reflex." But Sonny wasn't finished. He shifted his weight, crawling further into the port until he could reach Eli's head. He ignored the sensors taped to the baby's scalp. He moved his head until his snout was pressed firmly against Eli's left temple, the exact area where the MRI had shown the deepest shadows of dead tissue. Sonny closed his eyes and let out a deep, shuddering breath, his tiny frame going still. The room fell into a silence so profound it felt as if the hospital itself had stopped breathing. Then it happened. It was small. So small that if Rebecca hadn't been staring at her son's hand for 5 days, she would have missed it. Eli's right index finger, which had been limp and pale, suddenly gave a sharp, deliberate twitch. Then another. His hand didn't just move, it seemed to reach, his tiny knuckles flexing as they brushed against Sonny's golden fur. "He moved," Rebecca gasped, a sob finally breaking through her throat. "James?" He moved his hand. "It's a reflex, Becca," James said, his face pale as he gripped the railing. "The doctor said to expect involuntary spasms as the brain, as it settles." "That wasn't a spasm," Rebecca insisted, her eyes wild with a sudden, terrifying hope. He felt him. He felt the puppy. At that moment, the door swung open and Dr. Morrison walked in, his brow furrowed as he looked from the puppy in the port to the fluctuating monitors. He walked over, his expression shifting back to that clinical, professional distance. He checked the readouts, then looked at the puppy. "I understand the need for comfort," Morrison said, his tone gentle but firm. "And I see the movement you're talking about. But we have to be grounded in the science here. When the motor cortex is damaged this severely, the spinal cord can still fire off random electrical impulses. It's a phantom response. It doesn't mean there's cognitive awareness. It doesn't mean he's in there." He reached out to adjust the sensor, his movements efficient and cold. "The puppy is providing a heat source and a tactile stimulus that is triggering these reflexes. It's like a muscle twitching after a cramp. Please don't let this give you a false sense of recovery. The scans don't lie. The tissue in that region is non-functional." Rebecca looked from the doctor's cold, logical face down to the isolette. Sonny was still there, his nose pressed to Eli's temple, refusing to move even when the doctor bumped him. But as Dr. Morrison turned to leave, Rebecca saw something the doctor had missed. Eli's eyes, usually vacant and fixed on nothing, shifted. Just for a fraction of a second, the pupils constricted, and his head made a microscopic tilt toward the warmth of the puppy. It wasn't a reflex. It was a search. Rebecca felt a chill race down her spine that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. She looked at Sonny, who was now staring directly at her, his big brown eyes filled with an intensity that seemed almost human, as if he were trying to tell her that he was seeing a spark that the million-dollar machines were blind to. She realized then that the doctors were looking for life in the data, but the puppy was looking for life in the soul. And as Sunny let out a tiny, triumphant yip, Rebecca knew that the real battle wasn't against the brain injury, it was against a medical world that had already decided her son was a ghost. But as she looked closer at the monitor, she noticed something that made her heart stop. The EKG wasn't just fluctuating anymore. It was forming a pattern, a specific repeating code that seemed to trigger every time Sunny touched a specific spot on Eli's head. Was it possible the puppy wasn't just comforting Eli, but was actually mapping the parts of his brain that were still alive? And if Sunny could find them, could he lead Eli back to the surface? Rebecca reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the record button. She didn't know it yet, but the footage she was about to capture would do more than just prove the doctors wrong. It would ignite a firestorm that would reach the highest levels of neuroscience and force a choice that no parent should ever have to make. The question wasn't whether Eli could wake up anymore. The question was, what would the hospital do when they realized a 6-pound puppy was doing the job of an entire neurology department? Would they let Sunny stay, or would they pull the plug on the only miracle the Carters had left? The shadows in the neonatal intensive care unit seemed to grow longer and more oppressive after midnight. The overhead lights were dimmed to a soft, spectral blue, meant to mimic a natural sleep cycle for infants who no longer knew the difference between day and night. For Rebecca, the darkness was a canvas for her fears, but tonight, for the first time since the accident, the darkness felt different. It felt occupied. Thanks to a reluctant, compassionate care exception granted by the hospital administration, pushed through by a sympathetic patient advocate who had seen the viral potential of a grieving mother and a runt puppy, Sunny was allowed to stay. He wasn't just staying, he was presiding. The hospital staff had brought in a small raised pet bed, but Sunny had no intention of using it. He refused to be more than a few inches away from Eli. When the nurses tried to move him to change Eli's bedding, the puppy didn't bark. He simply went dead weight, a golden anchor of stubborn devotion, until he was placed back within sniffing distance of the baby's head. The first night was a masterclass in quiet observation. James had finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled into an uncomfortable ball on the vinyl recliner, his breathing heavy and ragged. Rebecca, however, was wide awake. She sat in the stillness, her eyes darting between the rhythmic rise and fall of Eli's chest and the way Sunny seemed to be vibrating with a strange internal frequency. At exactly 2 a.m., the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air felt charged as if a storm were brewing just beyond the sterile walls. Sunny, who had been dozing near Eli's feet, suddenly stood up. His movements were fluid and silent. He didn't look like a clumsy 2-month-old puppy. He looked like a soldier on a mission. He navigated the forest of 4 lines and sensor wires with impossible grace, eventually positioning himself at the top of the isolette. Rebecca held her breath. She watched as Sunny lowered his head with agonizing slowness, eventually resting his chin on the exact spot of Eli's left temple, the epicenter of the dead tissue Dr. Morrison had pointed out on the scans. Sunny began to whimper, but it wasn't a sound of distress. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the plastic walls of the bed. Minutes passed. Then at 2:15 a.m. the change began. Eli's breathing, which had been mechanical and shallow for days, suddenly deepened. His chest expanded in a full lung-filling draft of air. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation levels, which had been hovering in the precarious low 90s, shot up to a perfect 99. The rhythmic beep hiss of the ventilator seemed to stutter as the machine realized Eli was finally pulling air on his own. "Nurse?" Rebecca hissed, her voice a frantic whisper. A young nurse named Elena hurried in, her brow furrowed as she checked the readouts. "Everything okay, Mrs. Carter?" "Look at his breathing," Rebecca pointed, her finger trembling. "And look at the puppy. He's been sitting like that for 15 minutes. The moment he touched Eli's head, the oxygen levels jumped." Elena checked the sensors, her expression clinical and unimpressed. "It's a normal variation, Rebecca. Babies in this state often have autonomic fluctuations during the early morning hours. It's likely just a stabilizing reflex. And the puppy? Well, he's probably just attracted to the heat from the monitoring equipment." "It's not just heat," Rebecca insisted, her heart hammering. "He's targeting that spot. The injury spot." Elena offered a small, tired smile. "The mind plays tricks when you're this tired. Try to get some sleep. The machines are doing their job." But Rebecca didn't sleep. She watched, and she saw the pattern. By night 2, the variation had become a ritual. Sunny wasn't just sitting near Eli, he was performing a 3-point inspection. First, he would press his chest against Eli's chest, staying there until the baby's heart rate stabilized into a perfect, steady rhythm. Second, he would move to Eli's right hand, nuzzling the palm until the tiny fingers curled into a tight, reflexive grip. Finally, and most importantly, he would return to the left temple. Every single time Sonny touched these three specific zones, the heart, the motor hand, and the injury site, Eli responded. It wasn't the chaotic, random twitching of a damaged nervous system. It was a sequence. It was a dialogue. "James, look at this," Rebecca said on the second afternoon, pointing to her notebook where she had been logging the times and reactions. 2 a.m., 4:30 a.m., 7:15 a.m. Every time Sonny initiates contact, Eli reacts. He's not just twitching. He's answering. James looked at the notes, but his face remained a mask of weary skepticism. He ran a hand through his hair, which was greasy and disheveled. "Becca, honey, you're looking for a map in a bowl of alphabet soup. People see patterns in clouds when they're desperate. I talked to the neurologist this morning while you were in the bathroom. He said these micro-responses are common. The brain is firing off dying embers. It's not life." "Then explain why it happens every time." Rebecca's voice rose, drawing the attention of a passing doctor. "Why does a puppy know exactly where the damage is? Why does Eli only breathe deeply when Sonny is touching him? Because you want him to." James finally snapped, the frustration of his own grief boiling over. "We have to prepare for the meeting tomorrow, Becca. The ethics board. They're going to ask us about our long-term plan. That's hospital speak for stopping the ventilator. If we keep chasing these shadows, we're just prolonging his suffering. We're torturing him for a miracle that isn't coming." The words cut deeper than any medical diagnosis. Rebecca looked at her husband, the man who was supposed to be her partner in hope, and saw a stranger who had already surrendered. She looked back at the isolette. Sonny was staring at her, his head tilted, his big brown eyes filled with an ancient, knowing sadness. "I'm not chasing shadows," she whispered, her voice cold and determined. "I'm going to prove it." That night, Rebecca didn't just watch. She documented. She pulled out her smartphone and propped it up on a stack of medical journals, framing the isolette perfectly. She recorded the silence. She recorded the clock. And then she recorded the 2 a.m. miracle. The footage was undeniable. The video showed Sonny waking up, stretching, and purposefully moving to Eli's head. As the puppy's nose touched the temple, the monitor in the background clearly showed the spike in neural activity. Then Sonny moved to the hand, and the camera caught the unmistakable, deliberate closing of Eli's fist around a tuft of golden fur. But when Dr. Morrison reviewed the footage the next morning, his reaction was even colder than before. "It's fascinating, certainly," Morrison said, handing the phone back to Rebecca without a trace of wonder. "But from a clinical perspective, what we're seeing is a tactile-triggered spinal reflex. The puppy is a high-stimulus object. He has a heartbeat, he has scent, he has warmth. He is essentially poking Eli's nervous system, and the nervous system is reacting the only way it can, with involuntary motor bursts. It's like a frog's leg twitching when you apply an electrode. It doesn't mean the frog is thinking. But the pattern." "Reflexes don't have patterns, Dr. Morrison," Rebecca interrupted, her voice trembling with rage. "This is a conversation. Sonny is asking and Eli is answering." Morrison sighed, a sound of profound professional patience. "Mrs. Carter, we need to talk about quality of life. The ethics board is concerned that by allowing this therapy, we are encouraging a state of denial that is preventing you from making the necessary decisions for Eli. Even if these were signs of awareness, which the EEG still does not support, the level of brain damage revealed by the MRI is so extensive that any life Eli would have would be one of profound disability, pain, and total dependence. Is that what you want for your son?" The words were a direct assault on her motherhood. "Is that what you want? To keep a shell of a child alive because you're too selfish to say goodbye?" "I want the truth," Rebecca said, her eyes burning. "And the truth is that your machines are missing something that a 6-pound dog can see clear as day." "The board meeting is at 2 p.m. today," Morrison said, turning toward the door. "I suggest you and James discuss the reality of the situation. We cannot maintain this level of intensive care indefinitely for a patient with a 0 prognosis." After he left, the room felt smaller, the air thinner. James wouldn't look at her. He was staring at the floor, his shoulders shaking. The pressure from the hospital was mounting, a silent, bureaucratic tide meant to wash away their resistance. Rebecca walked over to the isolette. Sonny was already back at his post, his small body pressed against the glass, his eyes never leaving Eli. The puppy looked exhausted, his fur dampened by the humidity of the NICU, but he didn't move. He was the only thing standing between Eli and the mercy the doctors wanted to impose. "They're going to try to take him away, aren't they?" Rebecca whispered to the puppy. Sunny let out a soft, low growl, a sound so unexpected and protective that Rebecca felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity. She turned to James, her face set in a mask of defiance that he had never seen before. "They think they can vote on our son's life in a boardroom. They think they can tell us when his soul has left his body because a computer screen is blank." "Becca, what can we do?" James asked, his voice broken. "They're the experts." "No," Rebecca said, her thumb hovering over the upload button on her video sharing app. "They're just people with degrees. But the world loves a story about a dog who won't give up. If the doctors won't listen to us, maybe they'll listen to a million people asking why they're trying to kill a baby who is holding a puppy's hand." She looked at the screen of her phone, the thumbnail of the 2 a.m. video showing Eli's finger curled into Sunny's fur. It was a plea, a piece of evidence, and a declaration of war all in one. "I'm not giving up on our son, James," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet ward. "That puppy knows something they don't. He's finding the parts of Eli that are still in there, and I'm going to make sure the whole world sees it before they can pull the plug." As she hit the button, a notification flashed on the screen, a low battery warning, just as a shadow fell over the doorway. It wasn't a nurse or a doctor. It was a tall woman in a sharp gray suit, carrying a tablet and wearing a look of grim, institutional authority. The ethics board was early and they weren't coming to listen. But as the woman stepped into the room, Sunny did something he had never done before. He didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He stood up on Eli's bed and placed his paws directly on the baby's throat, his head cocked toward the door as if he were guarding a treasure. And in that moment, the monitor behind them didn't just spike. It flatlined in a long, continuous tone that brought every nurse in the unit running. Was Sunny sensing the end, or was he about to show them a trick that would make the flatline the most hopeful sound Rebecca had ever heard? The blue light from the smartphone screen was the only thing illuminating Rebecca's face, casting long, ghostly shadows against the sterile white walls of the NICU. It was 10:45 p.m. The unit had settled into its nighttime rhythm, the hushed whispers of nurses at the central station, the occasional hiss of a pneumatic door, and the unending rhythmic pulse of the machines keeping her son in a state of biological suspension. James had finally drifted into a fitful, twitching sleep in the corner chair, his face lined with the gray pallor of a man who had reached the end of his endurance. But Rebecca was wired, her nervous system humming with a desperate, frantic energy that no amount of exhaustion could dampen. She looked down at her lap, where she had been editing for 3 hours. On the screen was a rough compilation of the videos she had taken over the last 48 hours. She had titled the file, "The Conversation." The footage was raw, shaky, handheld, and sometimes blurred by the tears that had been dripping onto her lens, but the content was undeniable. There was the clip from 2 a.m., where Sunny's nose pressed against Eli's left temple and the EKG monitor instantly shifted its rhythm. There was the footage of Eli's tiny translucent fingers curling around a tuft of golden fur, a movement so deliberate it made her heart ache. And there was the final haunting shot, Sunny staring directly into the camera, his eyes wide and knowing, as if he were pleading with the world to see what the doctors refused to acknowledge. She felt like a conspirator in a silent war. The ethics board meeting earlier that day had been a nightmare of polite, clinical execution. They had spoken of neurological futility and resource allocation, their words falling like heavy stones into the quiet room. Dr. Morrison had been there, his face a mask of professional sympathy, his hands folded over a folder full of scans that looked like ink blots of death. They were closing the net. Within 48 hours they would likely move to withdraw life support, regardless of her protests. "They won't listen to me," she whispered to the puppy, who was currently curled into a crescent moon shape against Eli's side. "But maybe they'll listen to everyone else." With a trembling thumb, she opened a popular video sharing app. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it might burst. She knew the risks. She knew that by posting this, she was inviting the world into the most private, agonizing moment of her life. She was putting her son's broken body on display for the judgment of strangers. But she was out of options. She typed the caption with a fierce, shaking intensity, "My 2-week-old son has catastrophic brain damage. Doctors say he'll never wake up. But this puppy won't give up on him. Every time Sunny touches him, my baby responds. Am I crazy? Or is something miraculous happening? #Save Eli, #the puppy who knows, #medical miracle." She stared at the post button for a full minute. In that 60 seconds she thought about the perfect life they had just a week ago. She thought about the laundry she had left in the dryer, the coffee James had been making, the 30 seconds that had stolen her son's future. Then she thought about the way Eli's finger had squeezed. She hit the button. The upload bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. 10%, 45%, 88%. When the success notification finally popped up, Rebecca felt a strange, hollow sensation in her chest. The secret was out. The battle was no longer confined to this room. She set the phone on the bedside table, leaned her head back against the cold plastic of the isolette, and finally, mercifully, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep of total collapse. She was woken 6 hours later not by a nurse, but by a sound she didn't recognize, a continuous, staccato vibration. She sat up, disoriented, her neck stiff and her mouth dry. It took her a moment to realize the sound was coming from her phone. It wasn't just vibrating, it was buzzing so rapidly it was skittering across the table like a live insect. She picked it up and her breath hitched. The screen was a blur of notifications. 5,000 likes, 2,000 comments, 10,000 shares. She opened the app and the numbers updated before her eyes. The video had 500,000 views. In 6 hours, her private grief had become a global phenomenon. "James," she croaked, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "James, wake up." He groaned, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light that had just been turned up for the morning shift. "What? Is he okay?" He lunged toward the bassinet, his first instinct always being the worst-case scenario. "He's fine," Rebecca said, her voice trembling as she held out the phone. Look at this." James squinted at the screen. 500,000? "Becca, what did you do?" "I showed them," she said, tears beginning to spill over. "I showed them the truth." By noon, the explosion had become a wildfire. The comment section was a tidal wave of human emotion. There were thousands of people offering prayers, but more importantly, there were hundreds of stories that mirrored her own. "My cat did this for my grandmother when she had a stroke. The doctors couldn't explain it either," one person wrote. "Dogs sense the electromagnetic field of the heart. That puppy is jump-starting his nervous system," another claimed. By the 24-hour mark, the video had eclipsed 5 million views. It was trending on every major social media platform. The hashtag #SaveEli was being used by celebrities, influencers, and regular parents around the globe. The hospital switchboard was reportedly being overwhelmed by callers demanding that the Carters be given more time. Local news crews were already beginning to gather in the parking lot, their satellite vans casting long shadows over the hospital entrance. The headlines were already written: "The puppy who won't give up on brain-damaged baby." But with the light came the shadows. As the afternoon wore on, the tone of the comments began to shift. The initial wave of support was met by a secondary wave of skepticism and, in some cases, outright cruelty. James sat on the edge of the recliner, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of the phone screen as he scrolled through the latest updates. His expression, which had briefly held a flicker of hope, was darkening with every swipe. "Listen to this one," James said, his voice flat and wounded. "This is irresponsible. That baby is brain dead, and these parents are using a dog to justify their own inability to let go. It's cruel to keep a body alive when the person is gone." "Don't read those," Rebecca said, reaching for the phone, but James pulled it back. "And this one," he continued, his jaw tightening. "They're torturing that child for views. That puppy is probably just looking for a warm place to sleep, and they're projecting their grief onto it. The doctors are right, they should let him go in peace." James looked up at her, his eyes red and brimming with a sudden, agonizing doubt. "Becca, maybe they're right. Look at us. We're exhausted. We're fighting the best neurologists in the state because a puppy whimpers at 2 a.m. Are we being selfish? Are we holding on to a miracle that's actually just biology and luck? What if we're making it worse for him?" Rebecca felt a surge of cold fury. "Selfish?" James, look at him. Look at Sonny. Does that puppy look like he's just looking for a warm place to sleep? He hasn't eaten in 12 hours because he won't leave Eli's side. He's fighting for our son more than we are right now. "But the world is watching us now, Becca," James whispered. "They're judging us. If we're wrong, we're not just wrong in private anymore. We're the parents who couldn't let go. We're a cautionary tale." "Or maybe," Rebecca said, leaning over the isolette and placing her hand next to Sonny's golden head, "we're the only ones who actually see him. The doctors see a patient. The internet sees a story. But we're his parents, James. We're the only ones fighting for the boy inside the machines. If we don't do it, who will?" The argument was interrupted by the chime of an incoming email on Rebecca's phone. She wiped her eyes and glanced at the screen, expecting another media request or a message from a well-meaning stranger. But the sender's name made her breath catch in her throat. Subject: regarding your son Eli, Dr. Patricia Wells, Johns Hopkins. Rebecca's hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone. Dr. Patricia Wells was a legend in the field of neonatal neurology. She was the woman who had pioneered the study of neuroplasticity in infants, the one who had written the very textbooks Dr. Morrison probably kept on his shelf. James, Rebecca whispered. Look. They read the email together, their heads bent close in the dim light. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, the email began. I have spent the last 20 years studying neonatal brain injury and the hidden potential for recovery in the developing mind. I saw your video this morning. At first I was skeptical, as I'm sure your current medical team is. However, I've analyzed the footage of the puppy's interactions with your son's motor responses. What I see in those clips shouldn't be possible according to standard neurological models. The specificity of the puppy's targeting and the subsequent neural spikes on your monitor suggest a level of interaction that goes beyond simple reflex. I'm intrigued and quite frankly I am baffled. I need to see this in person. I have cleared my schedule and am flying out tomorrow morning. I hope you will allow me to observe Eli and Sonny. The question wasn't whether Eli could wake up anymore. The question was, what would the hospital do when they realized a 6-pound puppy was doing the job of an entire neurology department? Would they let Sonny stay, or would they pull the plug on the only miracle the Carters had left? A silence fell over the room, not the heavy, suffocating silence of the previous days, but a silence that felt electric, like the air before a lightning strike. The next morning the atmosphere in the NICU changed. The staff moved with a new kind of urgency, and even Dr. Morrison seemed on edge. At 11 a.m., the double doors opened, and a woman in a sharp navy blazer walked in. She was smaller than Rebecca expected, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that seemed to scan the entire room in a single second. Dr. Patricia Wells didn't go to the parents first. She didn't look at the charts. She walked straight to the isolette and stood perfectly still, watching Sonny. The puppy, usually wary of strangers, didn't bark. He looked up at her, let out a soft, low huff, and then returned his nose to Eli's temple. He's not just providing warmth, Dr. Wells said, her voice melodic and precise. She turned to Rebecca and James, a faint, professional smile on her lips. He's providing a targeted bioelectric stimulus. It's as if he's searching for a frequency. She reached into a large black bag she had brought with her and pulled out a piece of equipment that looked far more advanced than anything in the room. A portable high-density EEG cap with dozens of tiny shimmering sensors. Dr. Morrison's equipment is designed to find what's broken, she said, her eyes locking onto Rebecca's. My equipment is designed to find what's trying to heal. Let's see what that puppy is really detecting, shall we? As she began to fit the cap onto Eli's small head, Sonny stood up, his tail giving a single, slow wag. Rebecca held her breath, her heart racing as Dr. Wells flipped a switch on her tablet, and a series of complex, swirling colors began to dance across the screen. Wait, Dr. Wells whispered, her fingers flying across the tablet. That can't be right. She looked from the screen to the puppy, her face pale. The puppy isn't just reacting to Eli. They're communicating in a spectrum we don't even have a name for yet. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice a mere breath. What does that mean? What did you find? Dr. Wells looked up, and for the first time the clinical mask of the world-renowned scientist slipped, revealing a look of pure, unadulterated shock. It means, she whispered, that your son isn't just in there. He's trying to build a bridge back to us, and the puppy is the only one who knows the way. But there's a problem, a massive one, and we have less than 48 hours to solve it. The air in the NICU, usually stagnant with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy stillness of dormant hope, suddenly felt electric. It was as if the presence of Dr. Patricia Wells had brought a different kind of oxygen into the room, one that supported life rather than just maintaining its absence. She moved with a clinical, predatory grace, her attention oscillating between the tiny, unresponsive baby and the golden puppy that refused to be more than a breath away. The hospital staff hovered at the edge of the cubicle, their faces a mixture of professional resentment and guarded curiosity. To them, Dr. Wells was an intruder. To Rebecca, she was a lifeline. The standard EEGs used in most neonatal wards are designed for broad observation, Dr. Wells explained as she began unpacking a series of delicate, shimmering silver sensors from a velvet-lined case. Her voice was calm, yet it carried the weight of a woman who had spent decades staring into the mysteries of the human mind. They look for the storm, the big seizures, the obvious pulses. But what we're looking for today is the whisper. If Eli is trying to communicate, he isn't going to shout. He doesn't have the strength for that. He's going to use the back roads of his nervous system, the pathways that have been bypassed by the trauma. She began the painstaking process of applying the high-density EEG cap. It was a mesh of fine, spiderweb threads, significantly more complex than the bulky equipment Dr. Morrison had used. Rebecca watched, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, as Wells placed the sensors over Eli's left temple, the dark, shadowed dead zone of his brain. "If there is brain activity, we will see it," Wells said, her eyes meeting Rebecca's with a startling intensity. "And if your puppy is truly the catalyst, we'll be able to measure the exact millisecond of the interaction. This isn't just about faith anymore, Mrs. Carter. We're moving into the realm of measurable data." Sonny sat on the edge of the bed, his head tilted, his big brown eyes tracking every movement of Dr. Wells' hands. He didn't growl or whimper. He seemed to understand that this was a test. Once the sensors were in place and the tablet in Wells' hand began to glow with a series of complex, oscillating waveforms, she nodded to Rebecca. "Bring him closer," Wells commanded. "Let him do exactly what he does at 2 a.m. Rebecca gently lifted Sonny. The puppy was vibrating, his small heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her palms. She lowered him toward the port of the isolette. The moment his paws touched the bedding, Sonny didn't hesitate. He bypassed the toys, the soft blankets, and the 4 lines. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, lowering his head until his wet nose pressed firmly against the left temple of Eli's head, right between the silver sensors. For the first 30 seconds, nothing happened. The screen on the tablet showed a steady, low-voltage hum, the biological equivalent of white noise. Rebecca felt her heart sink. Was this it? Was the miracle shy under the light of professional scrutiny? "Wait," Dr. Wells whispered, her fingers flying across the touch screen. "Look at the parietal lobe. Right under the puppy's snout." A jagged, vibrant spike of violet light erupted on the screen. It wasn't a random twitch or a messy burst of electricity. It was a clean, rhythmic pulse that matched the frequency of Sonny's own breathing. "That's not possible," James breathed, stepping forward until he was hovering over Dr. Wells' shoulder. "That area?" Morrison said it was necrotic. He said it was gone. "Science is only as good as the tools we use to measure it," Wells replied, her voice trembling with an uncharacteristic excitement. "What we're seeing is a localized neural response. The puppy isn't just touching him. He's providing a bioresonance stimulus. It's as if his own nervous system is acting as a bridge, leaping across the damaged tissue to spark a response in the healthy cells beneath." Sonny shifted. He moved his head down to Eli's right hand, nuzzling the palm. Instantly, a second spike erupted on the tablet, this time in the motor cortex, another zone designated as catastrophically damaged. As the spike peaked, Eli's tiny fingers didn't just twitch, they closed. They wrapped around a tuft of Sonny's fur in a grip that held for 3, 4, 5 seconds. "I am witnessing neural activity in regions the MRI showed as dead," Wells stammered, her clinical mask finally cracking. "This isn't a reflex. A reflex is a loop that stays in the spinal cord. This is reaching the brain. This is awareness. My God, he's in there." The theory Dr. Wells began to outline was something out of a science fiction novel. She suggested that Sonny was detecting subtle electromagnetic fields or minute changes in blood flow, microsignals that the hospital's billion-dollar machines were too loud to hear. Or even more provocatively, that the puppy was instinctively performing a form of tactile stimulation that was forcing Eli's brain to reroute its signals. But the validation in the room was soon met with the cold reality of the institution. 2 hours later, the cubicle was crowded with the hospital's ethics board, a group of 5 men and women in dark suits, led by Dr. Morrison, who looked as if he had been forced to swallow a lemon. They stood in a semicircle, their arms crossed, staring at Dr. Wells' tablet with a skepticism that felt like a physical wall. One study, Dr. Wells, conducted in an uncontrolled environment with a domestic animal, is hardly grounds to overturn a catastrophic prognosis. The head of the board, a woman with iron-gray hair and a voice like dry parchment, said, "We have to consider the long-term resource allocation. We have other infants in this unit with viable futures who need this bed. This child is viable." Wells countered, her voice ringing through the NICU. "I have just shown you localized neural regeneration and voluntary motor response. If you withdraw support now, you aren't allowing nature to take its course. You are ending the life of a patient who is actively fighting for his own recovery." "It's an anomaly," Morrison interjected, his face flushed. "A curiosity." but the MRI from 48 hours ago shows. He was cut off by a sound that made everyone in the room jump. In the isolette, Sonny had suddenly stood up. He wasn't whimpering anymore. He began to bark, a sharp, frantic, authoritative sound that shouldn't have been possible for a puppy his size. He was pawing urgently at Eli's chest, his tiny claws clicking against the plastic, his eyes fixed on the baby with a terrifying intensity. "Get the dog out of there," the board chair shouted. "He's distressing the patient." "No. Look," Rebecca screamed, pointing at the bed. The room froze. Eli's right hand, which had been resting limply by his side, began to rise. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate movement, fighting against the weight of the atmosphere itself. The tiny arm trembled, the muscles in his forearm visible beneath his translucent skin. And then, before the eyes of the 5 board members and the 2 doctors, Eli's hand reached out, crossed the midline of his body, and closed firmly around Sonny's front paw. It wasn't a twitch. It wasn't a reflex. It was a hold. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt as if the walls of the hospital were leaning in to watch. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his stethoscope forgotten in his hand. He looked at the baby's hand, then at the puppy, then at the monitor. The EKG was racing, but it was steady. "That," Morrison whispered, his voice failing him. "That was voluntary." He reached for him. The board chair looked at the baby, her professional armor finally showing a crack. "Dr. Morrison, get him to the imaging suite." "No. I want a new MRI. I want every sequence we have." The next hour was a blur of motion. Eli was whisked away, Sonny trotting beside the gurney, refusing to be left behind even as they entered the restricted radiology zone. Rebecca and James sat in the waiting area, their hands intertwined, their breath held in a prayer that had no words. When Dr. Wells and Dr. Morrison finally emerged, they weren't arguing. They were walking side by side, staring at a set of film transparencies as if they were looking at a map of a new world. "We missed it," Morrison said, his voice devoid of his usual arrogance. "The previous scans showed the damage, but they didn't show the microvasculature. Look here." He pointed to the left temple on the new scan. Where there had once been a dark, empty shadow, there was now a faint, lace-like network of white lines. New blood vessels, new connections. There is active regeneration occurring in the dead zones. It's as if the brain is building a bypass around the injury. We've never seen this kind of speed in a neonatal recovery. "It's the puppy," Wells said, her eyes bright with a fierce, academic joy. "He stimulated the neurotrophic factors. He kept the spark alive long enough for the body to start the repair." Rebecca felt a sob of pure, unadulterated relief break from her chest. "So he's going to be okay? We can take him home." Dr. Wells' expression softened, shifting from the thrill of discovery to the gravity of the next step. She sat down across from them, her tablet glowing with a new set of data. "He has a chance now, Rebecca. A real measurable chance. But the window is closing. This natural regeneration can only go so far on its own. To truly save his cognitive function, to make sure he can walk, speak, and live a full life, we need to intervene while the brain is still in this plastic, heightened state of repair." She paused, her gaze steady. "There is an experimental treatment called hypothermic neural regeneration. It involves cooling the body to a specific temperature while administering a proprietary cocktail of synthetic neurogrowth factors. It's only performed at 3 centers in the world. It can lock in the progress Eli has made and accelerate the rest." "Then let's do it," James said, his voice firm for the first time in days. "Whatever it takes." "There are 2 problems," Wells said, her voice dropping an octave. "First, the treatment must begin within the next 5 days, or the regenerative window will shut permanently. After that, the scar tissue will be too thick to bypass." She looked at the floor, then back at them. "And second, because it's experimental, insurance has already flagged it as not medically necessary. The cost for the full cycle, including the specialized NICU transport and the growth factors, is $180,000. And the hospital requires the funds up front before they can even clear the lab space." The relief that had filled the room vanished, replaced by a cold, crushing weight. $180,000. In 5 days. They had a miracle in the bed, but they were about to find out that even miracles have a price tag that might be impossible to pay. "We have 5 days, Rebecca whispered, her eyes turning toward the window where the sun was beginning to set on another day they didn't have. 5 days to find a fortune, or we lose the son we just got back." But as she looked back at the isolette, she saw Sonny looking at her, his head tilted as if he were waiting for her to make the next move. He had done his part. He had found the life. Now it was up to her to save it. But as she reached for her phone to check their bank balance, a nurse rushed in, her face pale. "Dr. Wells? You need to see this. The puppy. Sonny, he just collapsed." The figure $180,000 hung in the sterile air of the NICU like a sentence of execution. It was a number so vast, so detached from the reality of a young couple living in a two-bedroom suburban home, that it initially felt surreal. Rebecca sat in the dim light of the ward, her eyes fixed on the digital clock above the nurse's station. It was 4:12 p.m. The clock wasn't just measuring time anymore, it was measuring the remaining life of her son's potential. Dr. Wells had been clear: 5 days. 120 hours to bridge the gap between a vegetative future and a life of possibility. James had spent the last 2 hours on the phone in the hospital corridor, his voice a frantic, low-pitched murmur that occasionally spiked into a tone of pure, unadulterated desperation. When he finally walked back into the cubicle, he looked as if he had aged a decade. He leaned against the cool plastic of the isolette, his shoulders sagging. "The insurance company was a brick wall, Becca," he whispered, his eyes glazed with a hollow kind of shock. "They used the word investigational. Since the FDA hasn't fully codified the hypothermic neural regeneration protocol for this specific type of neonatal injury, they classified it as an elective experimental procedure. They won't cover a single cent. Not the growth factors, not the specialized cooling equipment, not even the transport." Rebecca felt a cold, sharp anger pierce through her exhaustion. Elective? How is saving his brain elective? It's not a choice between a better life or a worse one. It's a choice between him being in there or him being a ghost. "I know," James said, sliding down the wall to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. "I talked to the hospital billing office. They said because of the cost of the reagents and the specialized staff required to monitor the cooling 24/7, they can't even order the supplies without the funds in escrow. We have $3,000 in our savings account, Becca. 3,000. We're not just short, we're on a different planet than the amount we need." The reality was a suffocating weight. They were a middle-class family. They had a mortgage, one car payment, and a modest safety net that had already been shredded by the initial week of intensive care. In the eyes of the hospital's bureaucracy, Eli's miracle had a price tag, and that price was non-negotiable. Rebecca grabbed her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. "We call everyone. Your parents, my parents, the church, our friends. Someone has to know someone. We can't just sit here and watch the clock run out." The next 6 hours were a blur of frantic, heartbreaking communication. Rebecca called her sister in Seattle, who cried and offered $500, all she had in her checking account. She called her aunt, her old college roommate, her former boss. Each conversation followed a devastatingly similar pattern: a gasp of horror, a flood of genuine tears, a sincere wish that they had more to give, and a modest donation that felt like a grain of sand being thrown into a canyon. By 10 p.m. on day one, they had raised exactly $4,200. They were still $175,800 short. The silence of the NICU that night was different. It was no longer the silence of mourning, it was the silence of a countdown. Sonny seemed to sense the tension. The puppy didn't sleep. He sat at the foot of the isolette, his ears perked, his eyes darting toward every footstep in the hallway as if he were guarding a fortress that was slowly being surrounded. "We have to use the video," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice cutting through the gloom of day two. James looked up from his laptop. "The viral video? Becca, the comments, the backlash." "I don't care about the backlash," she cried, her voice rising until a nurse glanced over the partition. "The world is already watching. If they want to watch us, fine. But they're going to help us save him. I'm setting up a GoFundMe." She titled the campaign "Save Eli's Brain. The Puppy's Miracle Needs a Second Miracle." She didn't write a clinical description. She wrote from the gut. She described the 30 seconds that changed their lives. She described the doctor who said he was gone. And then she described Sonny, the runt who saw what the machines missed. She attached the footage of Eli's hand closing around Sonny's paw, the moment that had silenced the ethics board. She hit publish at 9 a.m. For the first 4 hours, the numbers moved in a slow, agonizing trickle. $500, $1,200, $3,000. Every time she refreshed the page, her heart did a frantic somersault, only to land in the pit of her stomach when she saw how far the goal remained. By 8 p.m. on day 2, the total stood at $10,500. It was more money than she had ever seen in one place, yet it was a mockery of what they required. "It's not moving fast enough," she whispered, her eyes burning from the blue light of the screen. We're halfway through the second day. At this rate it will take months. We only have 3 days left. Day 3 was the breaking point. The news cycle had moved on to a political scandal and a weather system in the Midwest. The puppy who saved the baby was yesterday's human interest fluff. The donation ticker slowed to a crawl. James, usually the pragmatist, finally broke. He was standing by the window watching the rain streak down the glass, when he suddenly turned and punched the brick wall of the hospital room. It's about money, he screamed, his voice raw and ugly. Our son's life, his ability to think, to see, to ever tell us he loves us. It's all being decided by a bank balance. We're going to lose him because we're not rich enough to save him. He sank to his knees, sobbing with a violence that shook his entire frame. Rebecca didn't go to him. She couldn't. She was paralyzed by the same realization. She looked at Eli, so still and perfect in his cooling bed, and felt a despair so profound it felt like her soul was being extinguished. Even Sonny seemed to lose his spark. The puppy curled into a tight ball, a low, continuous whimper vibrating in his chest. I can't let him go, James, she whispered to the empty room. I can't. Then, on the morning of day 4, the algorithm did what human effort could not. A prominent talk show host, a woman known for her fierce advocacy for animal welfare and her massive global following, shared the link. She didn't just post it. She recorded a 3-minute video of herself crying while watching the footage of Sonny. This is why we fight for these souls, she told her 20 million followers. This baby and this dog found each other in the dark. Now let's be the light. The surge was instantaneous. Rebecca's phone began to chime with such frequency it sounded like a frantic heartbeat. $50,000? $75,000? $110,000. The trickle had become a flood. By noon, the campaign was the top trending topic on the platform. Complete strangers were donating $5, $50, $1,000. The comments were no longer skeptical. They were a chorus of collective will. But as the sun began to set on day 4, the momentum hit a terrifying plateau. The total reached $150,000 and stayed there. The initial rush of the celebrity's followers had passed, and the final $30,000 felt like an insurmountable mountain. We have 6 hours, Dr. Wells said, her face grim as she stepped into the room at midnight on the start of day 5. The growth factor lab needs a go by 6 a.m. to start the synthesis for the morning cycle. If we don't have the escrow confirmation by then, we miss the window. The neural pathways are already starting to solidify. Every hour we wait, more of those new connections are lost. Rebecca felt a surge of nausea. She grabbed her phone and did something she never thought she'd have the courage to do. She started a live stream. She didn't fix her hair or wipe the dark circles from under her eyes. She stood by Eli's bed, held the camera up so the world could see his tiny, pale face, and then she turned the lens on Sonny, who was looking up at her with such intense, liquid eyes it seemed he was pleading too. We are so close, she sobbed into the camera, her voice echoing in the quiet ward. $30,000. That's all that stands between my son and a life he was never supposed to have. Please. I can't lose my baby because I'm $30,000 short. If you're watching this, even if it's just $1, please help us save Eli. She ended the stream and sat in the dark, the only light the blue glow of the donation page. $152,000? $155,000? 3 a.m. $162,000. 4 a.m. $168,000. 5 a.m. $172,000. The clock on the wall seemed to be ticking louder with every passing second. $8,000. Was a used car. Was a vacation. It was the price of a child's mind. I'm going to tell Dr. Wells we can't do it, James said, his voice a flat, dead monotone. We'll use the money we raised for his long-term care. Maybe he'll have some quality of life. Maybe. The phone in Rebecca's hand rang. It wasn't a notification. It was a call from a private number. She answered with a trembling, "Hello? Mrs. Carter?" The voice was calm, female, and professional. This is the director of the Sterling Foundation. We've been watching your live stream. Our board just held an emergency vote. We don't believe a child's future should be determined by a clock. We've just transferred the remaining $30,000 to the hospital's escrow account. You can tell your doctors to start the treatment. Now. Rebecca couldn't speak. She dropped the phone and fell onto the bed, her cries of relief so loud they brought the night nurses running. James was laughing and crying at the same time, his hands tangled in his hair. The next few hours were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Dr. Wells moved with a renewed ferocity. "We're on," she shouted to her team. "Prep the hypothermic chamber. I want the growth factor infusion ready in 20 minutes." Eli was moved into a specialized unit that looked like a sleek, ice blue cocoon. It was a hypothermic chamber, a masterpiece of medical engineering designed to lower his core body temperature to exactly 33 degrees Celsius. The goal was to put his brain into a state of metabolic hibernation, allowing the growth factor cocktail, a shimmering amber liquid, to repair the neural connections without the interference of inflammatory responses. "The protocol is delicate," Dr. Wells explained as she adjusted the dials on the cooling unit. "We have to keep him at this precise temperature for 7 days. If he gets too cold, his heart could fail. If he gets too warm, the brain damage resumes. And because his autonomic system is so fragile, he needs a constant, stabilizing biorhythm." She looked at the floor where Sonny was pacing frantically, his nose pressed against the base of the chamber. "We're going to do something unusual," Wells said. "The cooling blankets cover his torso, but we need a natural stabilizing heat source for his extremities to prevent peripheral nerve damage. We've designed a special, sterile sleeve on the side of the chamber. Sonny can lie there. His heartbeat and his natural warmth will act as a biological anchor for Eli's system while we cool his core." For the next week, the room became a shrine to science and instinct. Eli lay in his blue-lit cocoon, a tiny astronaut in a sub-zero void, while Sonny lay in the special side sleeve, his body pressed as close as the plastic would allow. The monitors showed a beautiful, synchronous dance. Eli's heart rate was slow and steady, perfectly mirrored by the puppy's own resting pulse. By day 6, the progress was nothing short of miraculous. The EEG, which had once shown only the whispers of activity, was now producing clear, organized waves. The dead zones were lighting up with vibrant, electric potential. Dr. Wells was ecstatic, her tablets filled with data that she claimed would rewrite the books on neuroplasticity. "He's doing it, Rebecca," Wells whispered on the morning of day 7. "We're 48 hours away from bringing him back up to temperature. His brain is knitting itself back together. I've never seen anything like it." Rebecca felt a peace she hadn't known since before the accident. She sat by the chamber, watching the way the blue light caught the golden fur of the puppy who had made it all possible. Sonny had been a rock, barely moving, barely eating, his entire existence focused on the baby through the plastic wall. But then, in the middle of a routine growth factor infusion on the final evening, the rhythm broke. It started with a sound, a sharp, wet cough from the side sleeve. Rebecca looked down, expecting to see Sonny adjusting his position. Instead, she saw the puppy's body go rigid. His front paws were splayed out, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, the eyes that had seen the life in her son, were rolling back in his head. The cardiac monitor attached to Eli suddenly began to wail, the steady pulse turning into a chaotic, jagged mountain range of red lines. "Dr. Wells." Rebecca screamed. "Something's wrong. Sonny. Sonny, wake up." The puppy collapsed, his golden body sliding off the platform and hitting the floor with a sickening thud. He wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. And in the chamber, Eli's heart rate began to plummet in a terrifying, sympathetic mirror of the puppy's sudden silence. As the crash team rushed in, Rebecca realized with a jolt of pure horror that the miracle had just demanded a price she wasn't prepared to pay. Had Sonny given every ounce of his own vitality to spark the life back into Eli, and was it too late to save the one who had saved them all? "Get the puppy out of here," one of the doctors shouted as they swarmed the baby's chamber. "We're losing the infant's vitals. The anchor is gone." But as they reached for Sonny's limp body, Rebecca saw a dark, spreading stain on the floor beneath him, and her heart stopped. It wasn't just a collapse. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with the miracle dog, and the clock that had just stopped for Eli was now ticking for the smallest hero the world had ever known. The sound of the code bell ringing for her son was a noise Rebecca had heard in her nightmares, but the sight of the miracle puppy sprawled lifeless on the linoleum floor was a horror she hadn't been prepared to witness. The NICU, usually a place of hushed, calculated precision, erupted into a frantic, bifurcated war zone. On one side of the glass, a team of neonatal specialists swarmed Eli's hypothermic chamber, their hands dancing over dials and syringes as they fought to stabilize a heart rate that had plummeted the moment its biological anchor failed. On the other side, a lone nurse was kneeling over Sonny, her fingers pressed into the golden fur of his neck, her face pale. "He has a pulse, but it's thready. He's in respiratory distress," the nurse shouted over the din of the alarms. "Get him out of here." Dr. Morrison's voice was a whip crack of authority. "He's a biocontaminant in a crisis zone. Rebecca, you have to choose, stay with Eli or go with the dog. We need room to work. The choice felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Rebecca looked at the blue-lit chamber where her son was fighting for his mind, and then at the limp, golden bundle being lifted into a transport carrier. James was already at the doorway, his eyes wild, his hands shaking so hard he had to grip the frame to stay upright. "I'll go," James choked out, his voice thick with a sudden, protective ferocity. "I'll take him to the emergency veterinary surgical center down the street. You stay with Eli. You're his mother. You stay." Rebecca could only nod, her throat paralyzed by a silent scream. She watched as James disappeared down the hallway, running with the carrier, a desperate man chasing a fading light. She turned back to the chamber, her forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching as Dr. Wells adjusted the flow of the growth factors. The room felt suddenly, terrifyingly empty without the rhythmic, comforting presence of the puppy. The anchor was gone, and the silence that followed was a vacuum that threatened to pull Eli back into the dark. 3 hours later, the NICU had settled into a grim, expectant stasis. Eli's vitals had stabilized, but the vibrancy Dr. Wells had noted in his neural scans had flattened. He was back to being a patient, a biological problem to be solved, rather than a child on the verge of an awakening. Rebecca sat by the chamber, her phone clutched in her hand like a talisman, waiting for the call from the vet. When the phone finally buzzed, James's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "Becca," he whispered. "It's bad. It's really bad." Is he gone?" "No," James said, and the sob that followed broke what was left of Rebecca's heart. "But he's dying. They did an emergency ultrasound. He has something called patent ductus arteriosus, a PDA. It's a congenital heart defect. The vet said it's been there since he was born. He was the runt because his heart was never pumping quite right." Rebecca closed her eyes, tears leaking through her lashes. "Why now? Why did he collapse now?" "The stress," James choked out. The vet said the sheer physical and emotional toll of what he was doing for Eli, staying awake, matching his heart rate, providing that constant bioresonant heat, it was too much for a heart that was already broken. He literally gave Eli everything he had until his own system just gave out. He's in an oxygen tent now, but his lungs are filling with fluid. "Then fix it," Rebecca pleaded. "There has to be a surgery. We've seen miracles this week, James. We've seen them." The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. "There is a surgery. An open-heart repair for a puppy this small. It requires a specialized pediatric veterinary cardiologist and a bypass machine. It's the only way to save him." "Then do it. Tell them to start." "Becca, the cost." James's voice failed him for a moment. "I thought the vet was joking. I thought it was some kind of sick cosmic prank. The cost for the emergency surgical team, the bypass, and the post-operative intensive care, it's $180,000. Rebecca's phone nearly slipped from her hand. The number echoed in her mind, a mocking refrain. $180,000. The exact amount they had just spent to save Eli's brain. The exact amount the world had come together to provide in a once-in-a-lifetime surge of generosity. "We don't have it," she whispered, her gaze falling on the empty space where Sonny's bed had been. "We used it all. Every cent. The GoFundMe, the foundation money, it's all tied up in Eli's treatment. We have nothing left." The vet said without the surgery, Sonny has days. "Maybe only hours," James said. "He's fighting Becca. Even in the oxygen tent, he's looking at the door. He's looking for us. He's looking for Eli." The devastation that followed was a slow-motion collapse of their newly rebuilt world. They had climbed the mountain, they had reached the summit, and now they were being told that the bridge back to safety had a toll they couldn't pay. By midnight, James had returned to the hospital, leaving Sonny in the care of the night staff at the surgical center. They sat together in the small, windowless, quiet room, where they had first heard Eli's diagnosis. The irony was a physical weight in the room. They had a son who was finally healing, and a hero who was dying because he had facilitated that healing. "We can't ask them again," James said, his head in his hands. "We can't go back to the world and ask for another $180,000. They already gave us a miracle. They already saved our son. If we ask again, we look like we're taking advantage. People will turn on us. The backlash will be even worse than before." "But he's not just a dog," Rebecca cried, her voice echoing in the small room. "He's the reason Eli is still here. How do we put a price on that? How do we look at that puppy and say, 'Thank you for saving my child, now go die in a cage because we've reached our budget for miracles'?" "I know," James roared, standing up and pacing the small space like a caged animal. I know that. But where does it come from, Becca? We've tapped every resource. We've called every favor. We are bankrupt, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. The door opened softly and Dr. Patricia Wells stepped in. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than they had been that morning. She had heard the news from the nurses. There is one option, Wells said, her voice careful and measured. And I want you to know that I am only saying this as a scientist, not as a mother. I'm not advising this. I am simply presenting the facts of the situation. Rebecca looked up, a spark of desperate hope igniting in her chest. Anything. What is it? The remaining funds from the Sterling Foundation and the GoFundMe are allocated for the next 2 weeks of Eli's hypothermic neural regeneration and the subsequent growth factor cycles, Wells explained. It is a closed-loop budget. However, as the legal guardians and the administrators of those funds, you have the authority to reallocate them. If you were to stop Eli's treatment now, withdraw him from the chamber and cease the growth factor infusions, the remaining balance would be almost exactly what the veterinary center requires for Sonny's surgery. The room went cold. The silence that followed was a vacuum, sucking the air out of Rebecca's lungs. Stop Eli's treatment? James whispered. But you said the window is closing. You said these final 2 weeks are when the pathways solidify. They are, Wells said, her expression pained. If you stop now, the regeneration is incomplete. The progress he's made is significant, but it hasn't locked in yet. There is a high probability of neural regression. He might not go back to a vegetative state, but the cognitive recovery we're aiming for, the walking, the talking, the full life, it would be a massive gamble. We could lose 50-60% of the gains we've made. He could backslide into profound disability. The impossible choice was now laid bare on the sterile hospital floor. Save the son's future or save the puppy's life. One life for another. The very definition of a Faustian bargain. It's an impossible choice, Rebecca sobbed, her body racking with the weight of it. How can we choose? If we save Sonny, we might be condemning Eli to a life of struggle. If we save Eli, we are letting the only thing that loved him enough to die for him actually die. Sonny wouldn't want it, James said, his voice a harsh, defensive rasp. He's a dog, Becca. He's a hero, but he's a dog. He did what he did so Eli would live. If we sacrifice Eli's recovery to save Sonny, we're undoing everything that puppy fought for. It's an insult to his sacrifice. It's not an insult. It's loyalty, Rebecca screamed. He didn't think about sacrifice or logic when he was matching Eli's heart rate. He just loved him. And we're going to reward that love with a lethal injection. They argued until the sun began to peek over the horizon, a grueling, circular debate that left them both hollowed out. There was no right answer. Every path led to a different kind of grief, a different kind of guilt that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. By 9 p.m. the following day, Rebecca had reached her breaking point. She couldn't sit in the silence of the NICU anymore, watching the machines do the work that a puppy's heart used to do. She walked out into the hallway, sat on the floor of the waiting room and pulled out her phone. She didn't call a news station. She didn't contact the foundation. She simply opened her camera app and hit record. She didn't look like the brave mother from the viral video anymore. Her hair was a matted mess, her eyes were swollen and bloodshot, and her voice was a broken, jagged thing. I don't know what to do, she said to the camera, her breath hitching in a way that was painful to hear. I'm sitting here in the hospital and I'm being told I have to choose. The puppy who saved my son, the one you all saw, the one who found the life in Eli when no one else could, he's dying. He has a heart defect. He gave so much of his own strength to save my baby that his own heart is failing. She paused, a single fat tear tracking through the grime on her cheek. The surgery he needs costs exactly what Eli's treatment costs. $180,000. And we don't have it. We spend it all on Eli. The only way to save Sonny is to stop my son's recovery. The only way to save the hero is to risk the miracle. She looked directly into the lens, her gaze raw and pleading. The world helped us once. You gave us everything. You gave us our son back. I can't ask you for money again. I know I can't. It's too much. But I don't know how to choose. How do you decide which heart is worth more? How do you tell the world that the miracle has a price that we can't pay? She didn't add a link. She didn't add a call to action. She simply stopped the recording and hit post. The timestamp on the video read 10 p.m. Rebecca didn't wait to see the views. She didn't wait for the comments. She felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea and a need for silence. She powered down her phone, the screen clicking into a black void, and buried her face in her hands. She sat there in the dim light of the waiting room, the weight of the post button feeling like a stone she had just thrown into a dark, bottomless lake. She didn't know if the ripples would bring help or if they would just be swallowed by the silence. She didn't know if she would wake up the next morning to a world that called her a hero or a world that called her a monster. But as she sat there, the air in the hallway suddenly felt different. A strange, low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floor, a sound that shouldn't have been in a hospital. It wasn't a machine and it wasn't a voice. It was a rhythmic, steady thumping that seemed to be coming from the direction of the elevators. Rebecca looked up, her heart stopping. The doors to the unit were still closed, but the sound was getting louder. And then, from the nurse's station, a phone began to ring, not with the standard hospital chirp, but with a loud, insistent tone that made every nurse in the unit stop in their tracks. Is that the private line?" one of the nurses whispered, her eyes wide. Rebecca stood up, her legs feeling like water. She looked toward the elevators just as the doors slid open to reveal a man in a black suit, carrying a silver briefcase and looking like a ghost from a future they hadn't yet written. He didn't look at the nurses. He didn't look at the signs. He walked straight toward Rebecca, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her catch her breath. "Mrs. Carter?" the man asked, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "I've been looking for you. We saw the video. And there's someone you need to talk to before you make your choice." The 6 a.m. light was a cold, bruised purple, filtering through the windows of the hospital waiting room like an afterthought. Rebecca was slumped in a chair that had become her entire world, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt as though it had settled into her very marrow. Her phone, which she had powered down in a fit of soul-crushing despair at 10 p.m. the night before, sat like a dead weight in her pocket. She had spent the last 8 hours in a state of suspended animation, her mind a flickering carousel of impossible choices and the haunting image of Sonny's limp, golden body. Beside her, James was equally shattered, his head resting against the wall, his eyes closed but his jaw tight, a man waiting for a blow he knew was coming. Then the silence of the early morning was shattered. It wasn't the hospital's intercom or the squeak of a nurse's cart. It was James's phone. It didn't just ring, it erupted. It was a frantic, staccato vibration that didn't stop, a digital scream for attention. James jerked awake, fumbling for the device in his pocket, his face pale with the immediate fear that the veterinary clinic was calling with the news they dreaded most. "James? Who is it?" Rebecca whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. James stared at the screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't know. It's hundreds of notifications. Emails, texts, calls. Becca, look." He turned the screen toward her. The Save Sonny GoFundMe page, which had been a stagnant reminder of their financial ruin just hours ago, was moving at a speed that defied comprehension. The ticker was a blur of changing digits, spinning like a slot machine that had finally hit the jackpot. $120,000. $155,000. $190,000. "It's at 200,000, James breathed, his voice a mere thread of disbelief. "It's over the goal. It's still going." "How?" Rebecca gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "James, how is this possible? I didn't even put a link in the video. I just talked. I told them I couldn't choose." "The world chose for you, Mrs. Carter." They both turned. Standing at the entrance of the waiting room was the man in the black suit they had seen briefly the night before. He didn't look like a lawyer or a debt collector anymore. He looked like an emissary from a different reality. He was holding a tablet, and on the screen was a social media post that had been shared over 1 million times in the middle of the night. "My name is Marcus Thorne," the man said, his voice a calm, resonant anchor. "I am the chief of staff for Elias Sterling. Mr. Sterling is the CEO of Sterling Tech Industries. He saw your video at 2 a.m. He hasn't slept since." The name hit Rebecca like a physical wave. Elias Sterling was a billionaire, a visionary, a man whose face was on the cover of every business magazine in the country. But he was also a man who lived in the shadow of a private tragedy. "Mr. Sterling lost his own daughter, Maya, to a traumatic brain injury 6 years ago," Thorne continued, his expression softening into something deeply human. "He had all the money in the world, the best doctors, the most advanced technology. But he didn't have a miracle. He didn't have a Sonny. When he saw your video, when he saw that puppy refusing to let your son go, he said it was the first time in 6 years he felt like hope wasn't a lie." Thorne stepped closer, handing James a printed document. "Mr. Sterling has already contacted the Veterinary Surgical Center. He has wired the full cost of Sonny's surgery directly to their account as a private endowment. He told me to tell you this. Your puppy gave your son a chance my daughter never got. Don't you dare stop Eli's treatment. Keep the miracle going. I'll take care of the dog." Rebecca sank to her knees, the tiles cold beneath her, and finally the tears came, not the hot, stinging tears of grief, but a flood of pure, unadulterated relief that felt like a baptism. They didn't have to choose. The math of despair had been rewritten by a man who knew the value of a heart that wouldn't quit. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a new, more urgent kind of tension. The clock was still ticking. Sonny's heart was failing by the minute, and Eli was in the most critical phase of his thawing process after the hypothermic treatment. The day that followed became known in the hospital's history as the longest day. It was a day of parallel battles, of two lives suspended on the edge of a knife, separated by 3 miles of city streets. "We have to split up," James said, his voice firming with a new sense of purpose. "You stay here with Eli, Becca. Dr. Wells says these next 12 hours as his body temperature rises are when his brain will either lock in those new connections or collapse. He needs your voice. He needs to know you're there." "And Sonny?" "I'm going to the vet clinic," James said, grabbing his jacket. "I'm not leaving that puppy's side until he's out of surgery. He saved our son. I'm going to make sure he knows he's not alone." The separation was an agony of its own. Rebecca returned to the NICU, which now felt like a high-tech cathedral. Eli was still in the cooling chamber, but the process of rewarming had begun. It was an incredibly delicate procedure. If his temperature rose too quickly, his brain would swell, undoing all the microscopic repair work the growth factors had achieved. Dr. Wells was hovering over the monitors, her face a mask of intense concentration. "He's at 34 degrees, Wells whispered, her eyes never leaving the EEG waves. "His heart rate is steady, but the neural activity it's sensitive, Rebecca. It's like a seedling just breaking through the soil. One frost and it's over." Rebecca leaned over the chamber, her voice a soft, rhythmic hum. She told Eli about the sun. She told him about the backyard. She told him about the millions of people who were holding their breath for him. And most of all, she told him about Sonny. "He's in surgery now, baby. He's getting a new heart so he can run with you. You have to stay strong for him. You have to meet him halfway." 3 miles away, James was sitting in a different kind of waiting room, one that smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Through the glass doors of the surgical suite, he could see the silhouette of the pediatric veterinary cardiologist, a woman flown in on a private jet by Elias Sterling, bending over a tiny golden form on a massive operating table. Sonny looked impossibly small under the giant surgical lights, his chest open, his life being maintained by a bypass machine that was originally designed for human infants. "It's a patent ductus arteriosus repair," the nurse had told him. "We're basically tying off a vessel that should have closed at birth. But in a puppy this small, with a heart already weakened by stress, it's high risk. The next 4 hours will tell the story." James sat with his hands clasped, watching the minute hand of the clock crawl. Every time the door to the surgical suite opened, he flinched. He looked at the GoFundMe on his phone, which had now surpassed $300,000. People were still donating, still leaving messages of support. "Save the hero," one said. "The boy needs his dog," said another. Back in the NICU, the tension reached a breaking point. As Eli's temperature hit 36 degrees, nearly back to normal, the EEG monitor began to dance with a chaotic, jagged energy. "Dr. Wells, what's happening?" Rebecca cried. "It's a neural surge," Wells said, her fingers flying across her tablet. "His brain is waking up, all at once. It's like turning on the power to a city that's been dark for a decade. We have to keep the pressure down." The alarms began to wail. Nurses rushed in with cooling packs and sedative drips. Rebecca was pushed back, her heart shattering as she watched her son's tiny body arch slightly, his face twisting in what looked like a grimace of pain. "Eli, no. Stay with me." For 20 minutes, the room was a whirlwind of medical intervention. Rebecca could only watch through the glass, her soul screaming. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the alarm stopped. The jagged lines on the monitor smoothed into a beautiful rhythmic wave, a pattern of deep, restorative sleep. Dr. Wells stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow, a look of pure, unadulterated awe on her face. "He did it. He survived the rewarming. And look at the motor cortex." She pointed to a section of the screen that had previously been a flat, dead line. It was now pulsing with a steady, vibrant violet light. "He's not just alive, Rebecca. He's there." At that exact moment, James's phone buzzed in the vet clinic. He answered on the first ring. "He's out," the surgeon said, her voice sounding weary but triumphant. "The vessel is tied. His heart is beating on its own for the first time in his life. He's a fighter, Mr. Carter. He's already trying to wag his tail in the recovery tank." The double success was a miracle multiplied, a defiance of every statistic and every grim prognosis they had been given. But the true breakthrough happened 3 days later. Sonny was allowed to return to the hospital. He wasn't the shivering, dying puppy who had collapsed a week ago. He arrived in a special pet carrier, wearing a tiny, custom-made blue recovery vest to protect his surgical incisions. He was still weak, his golden fur shaved in patches, but the moment he entered the hallway of the NICU, his ears perked up. He let out a single, soft yip, a sound of recognition. The hospital had cleared the room. Even the skeptics from the ethics board were watching from the observation window. Dr. Morrison stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Rebecca lifted Sonny out of the carrier and gently placed him on the bed next to Eli. The baby was no longer in the chamber. He was in a regular bassinet, breathing entirely on his own, his eyes open and clear. "Look, Eli," Rebecca whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Look who's home." For a long moment nothing happened. The puppy and the baby simply stared at each other, two survivors of a war the rest of the world couldn't understand. Then, the moment that would be shared around the globe occurred. Eli's face, which had been a mask of neutral infant stillness for weeks, began to change. His brow furrowed, his mouth twitched, and then his cheeks plumped as he let out a soft, bubbling coo. A smile, a genuine, social, beautiful smile, spread across his face. It was the first sign of human connection, the first proof that his personality had survived the void. And Eli didn't stop there. With a slow, trembling effort, he lifted his right hand. It wasn't a reflex. It was a reach. His tiny fingers moved through the air, searching, until they found the soft, golden fur of Sonny's ear. He grabbed it, a weak but purposeful grip, and pulled the puppy closer. Sonny responded by leaning down and gently licking Eli's hand, his tail giving a rhythmic, happy thump against the mattress. "My God," Dr. Wells whispered, her eyes wet as she recorded the data on her tablet. "The neural pathways, they're regenerating at a rate that shouldn't be biologically possible. It's as if the emotional connection is acting as a superhighway for the physical repair. Whatever that puppy did, whatever bond they formed in the dark, it triggered a neurochemical cascade we've never seen in human history." The room was filled with a joy so heavy it felt like a physical presence. James and Rebecca held each other, watching their son and his dog, the two hearts that had saved each other now beating in perfect, healthy sync. But the silence was broken by a cough from the corner. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the baby's smiling face. He looked at the charts, then at the puppy, and then at the parents he had spent weeks trying to prepare for the worst. He took a long, deep breath, his professional mask finally falling away to reveal a man who was deeply, profoundly humbled. "I've spent 30 years in neurology," Morrison said, his voice quiet and steady. "I've relied on scans, on data, on the cold hard facts of what shouldn't be possible. I told you to let him go. I told you that hope was a cruelty." He paused, looking at Eli's hand still gripped in Sonny's fur. "I was wrong," Morrison said, his voice cracking. "I was catastrophically wrong. If you had listened to me, this moment wouldn't exist. Thank God you didn't listen to the science. Thank God you listened to the dog." The admission was a victory in itself, a validation of everything Rebecca had fought for. But as Dr. Morrison turned to leave, he stopped at the doorway, his brow furrowing as he looked at the latest brain scan printing out on the monitor. "Wait," Morrison whispered, his face turning pale. "Dr. Wells, look at the frontal lobe. The regeneration, it hasn't stopped. It's accelerating. It's moving into areas we didn't even treat." He looked at Rebecca, a strange, flickering fear in his eyes. This isn't just a recovery anymore. Something else is happening to Eli's brain. Something we didn't plan for. 3 months after the double miracle had captured the hearts of millions, the Carter household was no longer a place of hushed whispers and sterile dread. The heavy, suffocating silence that had once defined their suburban home had been replaced by a cacophony of life that Rebecca sometimes found herself listening to with a heart that felt perpetually on the verge of overflowing. There was the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of golden paws on the hardwood floors, the melodic jingle of a collar, and most importantly, the soft, gurgling coos of a baby who was no longer a prisoner of a broken mind. The recovery was not a sudden explosion. but a series of rapid-fire micro-triumphs that left even the most seasoned specialists at Johns Hopkins scratching their heads. It began with the eyes. Eli's gaze, once vacant and fixed on a horizon no one else could see, began to sharpen. One morning, while Rebecca sat in the nursery rocking chair, she moved a bright red plush ball across his field of vision. For the first time, Eli didn't just stare through it. His pupils constricted, his head made a tiny hitching tilt, and he tracked the color from left to right. He followed it back again. Then he looked up and locked eyes with his mother, a clear, unmistakable spark of recognition flickering in his blue depths. Beside the bassinet, Sonny was a constant, golden sentinel. The puppy's own recovery had been just as swift, his heart now pumping with a vigor that seemed to radiate from him. He had grown out of his blue recovery vest, replaced by a sleek coat of golden fur that Eli seemed obsessed with. To ensure safety, James had modified Eli's crib with a sidecar extension, a padded, low-walled platform where Sonny could sleep within inches of the baby without the risk of accidental rolling. Every night, the two of them slept in a tangle of limbs and fur, their breathing synchronized in a way that defied medical explanation. Whenever Eli grew restless in his sleep, Sonny would simply lift his head and rest a heavy paw on the baby's chest. Invariably, Eli's heart rate would slow, his breathing deepening as he drifted back into the restorative sleep of the healing. By the 6-month mark, the formal neurological follow-ups had become a source of academic frenzy. Dr. Patricia Wells had invited a small circle of her peers to witness Eli's evaluation, a group of skeptical high-level neurologists who arrived clutching Eli's initial catastrophic MRIs like shields against the impossible. They stood in the observation room, watching through the glass as Eli sat in a high chair, reaching out with both hands to grip a wooden teething ring. By every metric of modern neuroscience, Dr. Wells told her colleagues, her voice ringing with a quiet, defiant pride, this child should be in a persistent vegetative state. He should have no motor control, no tracking, and no cognitive engagement. Instead, he is not only meeting his developmental milestones, he is exceeding some of them. Look at the grasp. Look at the intentionality of the movement. He isn't just reacting to stimuli, he is navigating his world. The doctors remained silent as they watched Eli drop the ring and then look down, searching for it. When he couldn't find it, he barked, a sharp, demanding little sound. Instantly, Sonny, who had been dozing under the table, stood up, retrieved the ring, and placed it back on the tray. Eli let out a squeal of pure, unadulterated joy, his small hands splashing against the plastic. The synaptogenesis we are witnessing, Wells continued, is unprecedented. It's as if the dead zones weren't just repaired, they were bypassed and reinforced. We found that the proximity of the puppy's biorhythm during the hypothermic phase acted as a blueprint. Eli's brain didn't just heal, it modeled itself after the most resilient nervous system in the room. The turning point, the day that would forever solidify the story of the Carters in the annals of medical history, was Eli's first birthday. It was a crisp, sunny afternoon, and the Carters' backyard had been transformed into a festival of gratitude. The guest list was a surreal cross-section of their journey. Family members who had emptied their savings, strangers who had donated thousands, news crews who had chronicled the impossible recovery, and the doctors who had once urged them to say goodbye. Elias Sterling, the billionaire who had funded Sonny's heart surgery, was there, standing quietly in the back, watching the proceedings with a look of profound, healing peace. But the focal point was a colorful play mat in the center of the grass. The air was thick with expectation. The cameras were rolling, and the crowd had fallen into a respectful, bared-breath silence. Rebecca knelt on the grass, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at James, who was holding a birthday cupcake, his eyes shining with tears he hadn't yet let fall. "Okay, baby," Rebecca whispered, her voice carrying across the quiet yard. "Come on, Eli. Show them what you can do." Eli was positioned on his stomach, his legs tucked under him in a pre-crawl stance. Sonny was sitting exactly 3 feet away, his tail thumping the grass, his eyes locked on the baby with an intensity that seemed to pull Eli forward. Eli let out a determined huff. He reached out, his small, sturdy fingers digging into the grass. He began to scramble, a clumsy but purposeful crawl that brought him closer to the puppy. When he reached Sonny, he didn't stop. He reached up, his fist sinking deep into the thick, golden fur of Sonny's neck. He used the dog as a living, breathing anchor, his muscles bunching as he pulled himself upward. The crowd gasped as Eli's knees straightened. For a moment he wobbled, his balance precarious. But Sonny didn't move an inch. He braced his weight, acting as a solid golden pillar for the boy. And then, with a final, triumphant push, Eli let go of the fur. He sat. He sat completely unsupported, his back straight, his head held high. For the first time in his life he was a child sitting on his own, reclaiming the autonomy that the accident had tried to steal. The backyard erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar of collective joy, a catharsis for everyone who had ever dared to hope against the odds. Rebecca collapsed into James's arms, sobbing, while the news crew scrambled to capture the image that would lead the evening broadcasts. A 1-year-old boy, once declared brain-dead, laughing as his miracle dog licked the tears off his face. Dr. Morrison stood at the edge of the mat, his hands in his pockets, shaking his head in a slow, rhythmic motion of disbelief. "I've been a neurologist for 30 years, he murmured to a nearby reporter. "I've seen recoveries and I've seen remissions. But I have never seen a brain essentially rewrite its own ending. This isn't just medicine. This is a rewrite of the human potential." As the months rolled on, the milestones came faster. By 18 months, Eli was a whirlwind of energy. He was vocal, calling Sunday through Sunday, before he ever said "Mama," and his cognitive tests showed he was developing at the level of a 2-year-old. The final hurdle, the one that had been the subject of countless physical therapy sessions, was his gait. Due to the initial motor cortex damage, his legs were still prone to a slight, stiff tremor that made independent walking a challenge. The physical therapy clinic was a bright, airy space filled with foam blocks and parallel bars. The therapist, a patient woman named Sarah, looked at Eli and then at the golden retriever sitting patiently by the door. "He's ready, Rebecca," Sarah said. "He has the strength. He just needs the confidence. He's still looking for that anchor." Rebecca nodded and unclipped Sonny's leash. "Go on, Sonny. Help your boy." Sonny walked over to Eli, who was standing by a foam wedge. The puppy stood perfectly still, his shoulder height exactly right for Eli's reach. "Okay, Eli," the therapist encouraged. "Let's try walking." Eli didn't look at the therapist. He looked at Sonny. He reached out and grabbed the sturdy leather collar around the dog's neck. Sonny didn't bolt or pull. He began to move with an agonizingly slow, rhythmic pace, a therapy walk he had seemingly taught himself. Step. Eli's left foot moved forward, shaky but firm. Step. His right foot followed. Sonny matched him inch for inch, pausing every time Eli wavered, providing the physical and emotional ballast the boy needed. They moved across the room, a toddler in denim overalls and a golden dog, a single 6-legged organism of pure determination. By the time they reached the other side, Eli let go of the collar and took 3 independent, stumbling steps into Rebecca's waiting arms. "He's walking," James whispered, filming the moment with a hand that was finally, after 18 months, steady. "He's really walking." The story concluded not in a hospital or a clinic, but in the place where it had almost ended, the Carters' backyard. It was a late Saturday afternoon, the sky a bruised, beautiful orange. Eli, now a thriving toddler with a mop of golden brown hair, was running, actually running, across the lawn. He was stumbling, his laughter a high, bright sound that echoed off the fence, while Sonny ran beside him, matching his pace, his body always positioned to act as a soft landing should the boy fall. Rebecca sat on the porch steps, watching them, her hand resting in James's. She thought back to the 30 seconds at the door, to the blue face in the bassinet, and to the doctors who had told her to let go. She thought about the impossible choice and the billionaire's daughter, and the way the world had converged to save a single, tiny life. As she watched Eli and Sonny collapse together in a heap in the tall grass, she realized that the machines hadn't been wrong about the damage, they had just been blind to the remedy. "They told us to let go," Rebecca's voiceover whispered as the final image of the 2 survivors played out. "They said he'd never be more than a body in a bed. But we learned something they didn't know. We learned that the human brain is a map of our connections, and sometimes when the map is torn, it takes a heart that doesn't understand impossible to draw a new way home. Sometimes the greatest medicine comes not from what we understand, but from a love we can't explain, a love that comes on 4 legs." The final image lingered, Eli's small hand resting on Sonny's chest, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of the heart they had fought to save, while Sonny's paw rested over Eli's hand. 2 hearts, once broken, now beating as one. Closing text, Eli Carter is now 3 years old and developing typically. Sonny remains his constant companion. The hypothermic neural regeneration therapy used to save Eli has since been refined and approved, helping 47 other children with brain injuries. Dr. Wells credits Sonny with discovering what machines could not, that the human brain's capacity for healing is greater than we ever imagined. But as the screen fades to black, a final, chilling question remains. Why did the latest brain scans show that Eli's neural development hasn't just normalized, it's beginning to display patterns never before seen in a human child? And what did Dr. Wells mean when she whispered that Eli and Sonny aren't just bonded, they're beginning to think as one? Sonny was the runt of the litter, weak, small, and ignored. Yet he did what million-dollar machines couldn't. He almost died twice just to see Eli smile. If a tiny puppy can sacrifice that much, can you take 2 seconds to hit like and subscribe? It's the simplest way to say, thank you, for the lesson they taught us today. Help us reach the next person who feels hopeless by commenting, "Stay strong" below. Don't be the person who watches a miracle and walks away without acknowledging it.